This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Are head coaches overrated? This is a question I've been thinking about for a long time because as I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, it's hard for me to count at this point. I think it'd be 5 in November. I have heard many people blame the head coach for all of the problems of the team. And I have never been somebody who can get on board with that. I think that it's a little naive to think that all of the problems that you have with the football team can be boiled down to the head coach. But I've never really explained why I feel like the head coaching position is overstated in its importance, whether people are speaking negatively or even positively of the head coach. So that's what I want to do today. I want to talk about, are head coaches overrated? Before I do that real quick, I want to give a shout out to the YouTube members. We're at 26 right now. We just need 4 to get to 30. So if we get 4 more of y'all, we'll do a special surprise live stream sometime soon, if we can get to 30 soon. So again, I want to thank everybody who has joined. Shout out to them. Give a salute to every badge member in the comment section, and make sure y'all comment below. But now let's get back to the video. So in my quest to figure out why I feel this way about head coaches, why I don't ever feel like firing a head coach is a catch-all solution, and why I also feel like sometimes you just got to keep who you can keep as long as they're competent, because it's not that they're rare, but the stability of a coach is more important than their technical ability, because I think their ability is overrated in both directions. So that got me to ask, what is a head coach's job? And if you listen to people who usually blame head coaches for a lot of issues, thus making them very important in their blaming of them for all the issues, you'll hear things like development, strategy, and discipline being cited as their job, as well as just general leadership. And I question whether 3 of those 4 things are actually the head coach's job, or mainly the head coach's responsibility, if we're talking about it in kind of a technical definition for what a head coach is, right? When it comes to development, this is one that I see people throw at head coaches a lot. You get some players that don't develop out well. You blame the head coach as well as the GM. And that's because people believe that the head coach is supposed to identify players and put them in roles to succeed. And I think to a point that's correct. Where I think it gets wrong is it's not a universal, he's got to identify people or she's got to identify people and put them in areas to be successful. It's more on a situational basis, because head coaches have specific disciplines that they've studied a lot in, right? Offense, defense, special teams, whatever it is, that's where they're qualified to make those development decisions. And that's where they have to see things clearly. Other than that, if they're talking about something that's outside of the head coach's main discipline, then defensively, like, hey, that's up to the defensive coordinator most of the time. Special teams, that's up to the special teams coordinator. Coordinators are very important. Those are the people on the ground who have to kind of identify for their side of the ball. Hey, I think Martin Emerson can play outside corner. I'm gonna put him at outside corner. Let's see what happens. You know, are you okay with that, coach? Right? That's where a lot of those development decisions get made, is usually at the coordinator position. Yes, every once in a while, a head coach, especially for like a first-round draft pick, will say, I like this guy and I want him to do this for me, especially if it's on their discipline of the ball. But oftentimes when we're talking about more fringe players or more middle-of-the-road players that get developed into role players, then those choices and decisions were made from the coordinators. So it's kind of questionable whether development is the sole responsibility of a head coach, or whether the head coach is the main proprietor of the development of players on the team, because I can argue that it's mainly the coordinators who have to handle that at their specific positions. Strategy wise, okay, head coach, he makes the strategy. And sometimes I think we envision like head coaches as like these generals, like these war generals who are plotting out everything and they're figuring it all out. But much like a lot of the stories of people just like coming up with war strategies by themselves are kind of like proven to be wrong over time. The same thing's true of head coaches and strategies. The truth is that this stuff is built upon throughout collaboration, right? A strategy is not made because Kevin Stefanski woke up one day and decided this is what I'm going to do. A strategy is made because Kevin Stefanski, the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, whoever he's trying to strategize with, have spent countless meetings trying to figure out a strategy, right? With, especially if it's a defensive coordinator. So if it's Jim Schwartz, we're talking about in the Brown system, that's somebody who's going to have a little bit more say than like a Alex Van Pelt, who's not the main offensive coordinator. Like he's the offensive coordinator, but it's really Kevin Stefanski. I'll get to that later. So strategy, a little bit. Coach has his hand on strategy, but also a lot of that strategy comes from the coordinators. A lot of that strategy comes from the defensive special teams guys. A lot of that strategy comes from the offensive coordinator. Some of that strategy even comes from the wide receivers coaches. Some of that strategy comes down to positional coaches. What I'm saying here is that it's a collaboration. And the head coach is one piece of that collaboration, but the collaboration can continue on without the head coach. If you had nobody but the head coach, the collaboration could not work, right? There would not be strategy out there on Sundays if there was just the head coach. But everything underneath the head coach makes the head coach able to work. What about discipline? No. Not in the NFL. And again, I'm only talking about the NFL. If you want to say something about high school, even college football, sure, go ahead. Pee-wee, Pile 6, whatever they call it nowadays. Like if you want to say something about that and what the role of a coach is there, sure. I'm talking about the NFL. I really could care less about those levels of coaching. That's not what I'm talking about today. So what I'm saying, why I say discipline is not even a primary function of a head coach's job is because that's what the NFL's bylaws are for, is for discipline. You can't discipline players as a coach. These are players in a union with rights that you can't just discipline, right? In college, maybe you could discipline guys, and it's a gray area whether that's acceptable or not. But in the NFL, you ain't taking away somebody's contract because you're mad at them. You're not kicking somebody off the team because you're mad at them. If they're a very important player, like you're not doing any of that. There's no discipline. There's no tools for the coach to be disciplined, and it's not a structure meant for coaches to discipline players. The league disciplines players. That's where discipline comes from in players. When it comes to smaller instances of discipline, whether it be like penalties or anything, that's on them. They have to be disciplined for themselves because they're professionals. So I don't think the discipline is the head coach's job, and nor should it be seen as a head coach's job with professional football players, because these are grown adults. They should be responsible for their own discipline the same way that everybody else is responsible for their own discipline. Your job ain't responsible for your discipline. You are, right? Like that's a universal thing. I don't know why we think once we get to football players or athletes that discipline is now suddenly the job of the coach. It's not. So what's the coach's job? What's the coach's function, right? In my belief, what do I believe the coach's function to be? I think the coach is a middleman. And I think it's fitting that head coaches usually get comped to CEOs. And much like a CEO's job is supposed to be this intermediary between the needs of the shareholders, the needs of its employees, and the needs of the public, keyword supposed to, a head coach is supposed to be the intermediary between the front office, the coordinators and coaches beneath him, and the players. And there's supposed to be this one mesh point where everything forms and they're supposed to make the decisions, right? Now, I question whether that's the best way to structure something, because maybe the people who are most qualified in their specific role should be the ones who make those decisions when we're talking about football. But nonetheless, that's kind of how things are done. Much like CEOs have been kind of mythologized and put on a pedestal that they don't belong to, I think that head coaches are in a similar light. And again, I understand head coaches do serve a purpose, but that purpose is also manufactured. They make the decisions because they decided that they were going to be the ones making the decisions, not necessarily because they're the most qualified people to make those decisions. There's a difference there, right? And I think it's not a coincidence that if you look at the most successful head coaches in the NFL, these are coaches who operate on game day more as coordinators than they do head coaches and CEOs, right? Like they're not overseeing everything. They're really playing a specific discipline with a specific interest to their discipline. So defense, offense, special teams, whatever it is. And then making some decisions after careful, counseling from everybody involved in that decision. That's usually how these things get done. And if you don't believe me, Bill Belichick, defensive guy. We know that he runs the defense in New England. Andy Reid, offensive guy. We know he runs the offense. You know what Pete Carroll's discipline is, right? Mike Tomlin, we know that he runs the defense in Pittsburgh. They all have coordinators underneath them, but the good head coaches, the great head coaches, especially amongst the active ones, are the ones who kind of pay attention to what they really know and let other people make decisions on the things that they don't really know about, and give those guys more autonomy. And that makes sense because let's say you're a head coach and you don't have a specific discipline. You're just a great leader, whatever that means. But you have a defensive coordinator who's very qualified and has more knowledge than you on the defensive side of the ball. You have a special teams coordinator who's very qualified and has more knowledge than you on special teams. You have an offensive coordinator who's very qualified and has more knowledge than you on the offensive side of the ball. But yet you are the one making the decisions, the person who's less qualified, who has less knowledge about any side of the ball that they're talking about, and they're making the key decisions that the team's going to act on. And all of a sudden you look around, the head coach is the bottleneck. One of the best qualities a head coach can have is to know their role. And what I mean by know their role is know that they're not going to be the most knowledgeable person about everything to ever happen on the football field at all times. They have to accept that they're not a defensive expert. They have to accept that they're not an offensive expert. They have to accept that other people might know more on their staff about certain players, where those players can and cannot be used. They have to accept the knowledge of the people who work beneath them and use that knowledge to help the team become better. Oftentimes when I'm talking about Kevin Stefanski, I hear people say, well, he's not an offensive head coach. It just doesn't matter what the offense does. But he kind of is an offensive head coach, the same way that Bill Belichick's kind of a defensive head coach, right? You're not really ready to throw Bill Belichick out the window because the offense has been bad, because we understand that Bill Belichick is not the main proprietor of the offense. He is the main proprietor of the defense. No good head coach pretends to be great at all three sides of the ball. Even guys like John Harbaugh, who have made it a very long time in this league while being a special teams coordinator, he usually just kind of focuses on special teams and lets offense and defense do what they need to do. A lot of expectations for head coaches and our hopes for head coaches kind of get wrapped in to this great man theory where we expect the head coach to be in charge of everything, and we judge a head coach as if they're in charge of everything and making every decision. But I think the best head coaches are the ones who understand that they're just one part in this giant chain of reaction, right? And they focus on making sure that they do the parts that they can control the best and do their best to help others be the best that they can be at the parts that they're not qualified to do. So what do I think a head coach's job actually is? Well, I think first and foremost, a head coach's job is to be a good coordinator. It makes no sense if you get hired because you're one of the best offensive coordinators in the NFL for you to take the job and stop doing what you've been good at. Makes no sense. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have an offensive coordinator. That doesn't mean you don't have help. Again, I don't think you should have the hubris to think you could do it all, but you're going to be in charge of the offense more so than you are with the defense, because that's where you're qualified to be super in charge of and have your fingerprints all over. And that's fine. That gives your team an identity. Again, you look at teams with identities, it's because they have head coaches who specialize in a certain area and made sure that their fingerprints were in that specialization. You look at Pittsburgh, what's their identity? Oh, they're a great defensive team. Well, Mike Tomlin been there for a long time. That's probably why they have that identity. Before that, it was Bill Cowher, who was a defensive coordinator and a linebacker in the NFL. So it makes sense that that's what your identity would be. The Patriots, what's their identity? Being a great defensive unit. The Kansas City Chiefs, their identity is being great on offense. Andy Reid. The head coach is there to put their specialty on the team. If you're an offensive head coach, your job is to, number one, be an offensive coordinator, be a really good offensive coordinator. That's how you give your team an identity. Since Kevin Stefanski's gotten here, we've gotten an identity as a team that's decent on offense when it comes to running the ball and being able to do all the zone wide stuff. Like, we have that identity. It's not a mistake. That's how things are supposed to be there. So that's number one. If you hire a good offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator to be your head coach, their job is still to be a good offensive coordinator, special teams coordinator, or defensive coordinator. They don't just magically give that up because now they're head coach. No, that's part of their job, is to be very good at that stuff, because that's how you build an identity. When you hire a head coach, you're saying, hey, they're so good at the offensive side of the ball that I want to make that my identity. So that's who we're hiring. Or they're so good at the defensive side of the ball that I want to make that my identity. So that's who we're hiring. That's the whole purpose of hiring coaches with specialties, and why we don't just have coaches that are in the league just to be general head coaches. No, it's specifically, you want an identity as a football team. You want to hire somebody who can give you that identity. Identifying roles for players to excel in, I think, is a key part in a coach's job, especially if they specialize on the offenses for defensive side of the ball. To me, I don't think out-coaching or being out-coached is when, a coach gets a trick play called on them and it works and people go, oh, he got out-coached. That's just being outmaneuvered. It happens. Everybody gets outmaneuvered every once in a while. What I think is being out-coached is when you lose a player to another team and that team picks up that player and develops him into exactly what you were trying to develop him into. Or they figure out a way for that player to be good. For example, if John Johnson left Cleveland, went back to another team and became John Johnson again, then whoever is the defensive coordinator for that team clearly outcoached Joe Woods. If Jim Schwartz comes in here and gets a bunch out of Perion Winfrey, he clearly outcoached Joe Woods. When a coach steps in and is able to identify a role for a player that you couldn't, or put a player in a position to be successful that you couldn't, that's being outcoached. Not necessarily, oh, you got a trick play ran on you, or they ran outside zone on you, but you had nothing to do to stop it because you didn't have the personnel. No. If a coach is able to take the same talent you had, figure out something to do with that talent that you couldn't figure out, yeah, that's the better coach. They outcoached you. So that's also something I look at, right? And I think most importantly, the last thing for me and what a good head coach looks like is somebody who can ensure a positive work environment. Do people like going to work? They ain't gotta love it. They ain't gotta dance to go to work, but they gotta relatively enjoy their work environment. I know some people are gonna scoff at this and act like, oh, you have to be okay with your work environment being miserable. That's not true. You're gonna do your best work when you feel good about going to work. I've done my best work when I know I'm going to work, I'm gonna see my friends and, be able to do this and feel generally good about the amount of hours of my life that I am dedicating to this place. You have to feel good about that. A coach's job is to make sure that every player can walk in and feel good about that. You're not going to get every player to walk in and feel good about that. There are going to be some people who just are grumpy, but you got to make sure that by and large, most people feel good about coming to work every day, about the environment that they're walking into. And if you can't make that happen, then you're probably not going to be that successful as a head coach. So I say all this to say, are head coaches as important as we make them out to be? No. They are not the universal decider of winning or losing a football game. Getting rid of a head coach is not going to solve all your problems. Getting rid of all your coaches is not going to solve your problems. Players are a big part of the reason you win or lose every Sunday. Coaches have a role in that. A lot of things have a role in that. Weather, injuries, timing, luck, how people feeling that day, like all of those things have a role in it. So are coaches overrated? I think they are, but it's not because they're not important. It's just because we made them way too important in order to simplify the game, to point at somebody and get a scapegoat. But that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night.